Welcome back to the Fourth Way Podcast. So we are now coming to the end of our season on simplicity. And throughout this season, over the last, 20 to 30 episodes, I've made the case for what a simple life is and, what that looks like, what it doesn't look like, some of the downsides of complexity and the upsides of simplicity. But I think one of the questions that still needs to be answered or addressed is, okay, so what? Now I know what the simple life is more, and I know what complexity is, and maybe I even know some of the downsides of it, but is the simple life meaningful? Is there any purpose to it? Like, what is the point of living the simple life, even if I know what it is? Because if you think about it, a lot of the simple life is uncomfortable. It means foregoing a lot of things that people would say are very pleasurable, or pursuing the things that can acquire pleasure for you, like a lot of money. It maybe keeps you from accomplishing as many things or as great of things as you might otherwise accomplish, because you are not going to try to squeeze efficiency out of everything, but you're going to give room for rest, and you're going to not try to be so busy or be in a hurry, because you know that those things produce characteristics and traits that just are not good. Not good in the sense of traits that you might want to have that work well in relationship with others or with God, but traits that might be good if you want to get ahead in life, if you define ahead as making lots of money or having power over other people. So in that sense, simplicity can seem extremely pointless, right? We feel the need to wring value out of every moment. If you're not wringing value out of every moment, then are you really living a less fulfilled life? And of course, that begs the question, what is the value of life? Or what is the purpose of life? I think sports offer a really good analogy here, right? So think of the aspect of scoring, right? That's kind of like value in sports, right? Your value comes in your score. Now, scoring isn't necessarily a good thing, though, right? Just think about golf versus soccer. In golf, you want a lower score. You don't want to score points. And in soccer, you want to score more points. So even in these two games where score is where we find our value, those values can look very different for the winner, right? A low score versus a high score. You could also think about riding a bull versus Formula One. The more time you're on a bull, the better. In Formula One or NASCAR or any other racing, the higher your time, the worse it is. So in sports, the purpose of each of those games, right, is determined by what is valuable. So in soccer, what is going to score me the most goals, or what is going to prevent goals being scored against me? And so figuring out that balance of how do we produce the most goals with the least goals against. But even more than what is valued, right? There's another aspect to this that we have to think about. There's also, what are the parameters of that game? You can watch little kids play a game, and you see this all the time. If they're playing something like Cops and Robbers, right, the little kids always like, bam, bang, bang, I shot you all, right? They have perfect aim, and then when they get shot at, they never die. They kill everyone else, but they can't die. Or if they're getting into a verbal argument, one kid will inevitably say, well, infinity, always one more than you, right? And so instead of like invoking the logic of, another higher number and then a higher number, they just invoke these, like God modes where they're the best. They defeat everybody. They don't have to play within any rules. They just dominate. Kids go out of bounds all the time trying to win a game, trying to achieve what is valuable. It would be akin to, going back to the soccer analogy, if you got, MMA fighters to man your soccer team, and you're just all of a sudden like taking everybody on the other team out. Like, MMA fighters are great at taking people out physically, right? But that doesn't fit within the rules of the game. And when you get 11 red cards, you've got nobody to defend, and you're going to get no goals for you, and you're going to get lots of goals against you. Going out of bounds, not playing by the rules of the game, doesn't let you achieve the value. If you recognize the value as goals and you employ MMA fighters, you're still not going to get the goals, even though you recognize that the goals are what's valuable. And that's because you're not playing by the parameters of the game. Now, that's easy to see with little kids' games or see in sports, right? To recognize the value as well as the parameters of the game. But in real life, it's a little bit different because there is significant disagreement on what is purpose and what is value. And if you identify those values correctly, what then are the parameters of the game? And right now, for the last, 5 or 10 years, Christian nationalism has been something at the forefront of my mind, as well as a lot of people in the Christian culture and the United States in general, just because of the rise of this nationalism and theocratic tendencies and all of that kind of stuff. But if you take a look at the Christian nationalist value, it's this idea of the implementation of national dominance, or, for Christian nationalists, Christian dominance in the nation. They want a comfortable life, free of persecution, with the implementation of God's law. Okay, I think I can agree with those values. I would love for freedom. I think that's a very important value. Freedom and, people doing what's right. People obeying God's laws. Because if people are obeying God's laws, then they will love God, and that will lead them to love others. What more could you want for society but a society that allows for freedom and that doesn't do violence to people, and that cares for people, that implements justice, social justice, right? Because you're loving God and you're loving others. Of course, that's a great value, right? So while I would agree significantly, I would align very much so with the desire of the Christian nationalists in terms of loving God and loving others, right? Seeing his law implemented in that sense, and living a life of freedom and free of persecution for people. While I align with their values, in terms of the parameters that they view us playing by, I would disagree significantly. Christian nationalists may give lip service to many of the same values that God wants. Things like sexual fidelity, worship of God alone, justice, right? Those sorts of things. They're running out of bounds with the ball all the time. Right? They're tackling their own teammates, and they're employing MMA fighters to take out the other team. Right? And they think that they're scoring points. They think that they're scoring points and getting, obtaining the value because they recognize true value, yet they're not employing the means that get you that value. They latch on to value without observing the parameters, the boundaries. Now, we could go down the list. We could find other people that have different forms of value. They identify different forms of value, different parameters to the game, all that, right? Nihilists might say that there is no purpose. Hedonists, who could also essentially be nihilists, could say that we define our own purpose. The disagreements just go on and on about what is value and what are the parameters for obtaining that value. So to argue for a simple life, as I have done this season, is really to butt up against all of the value systems that exist. We're all playing the same game, right? We essentially have to be. The game of life, if it's fashioned by a creator, we're playing that game. Or maybe we're playing the game of life that just arose by chance, and there is nothing outside of ourselves that imposes meaning, right? We're all playing the same game. We might just disagree about the game that we're playing. But many of us who are playing the game of life, we're all going about it, playing the game by many different playbooks. When there's only one playbook that really that's really going to fit our the parameters of the world that we live in, of reality. In this episode, then, I want to make a case for purpose and value from the Christian point of view. And in fact, I want to say that on any other system that's at least non-theistic, on any other system, particularly naturalism, there is no such thing as purpose, right? It just doesn't work. I want to argue that God determines and grants us purpose and value. Now, if I'm right, and if we know that purpose and value come from God, that doesn't then mean that we're going to attain that value. We're not going to necessarily score the goals, because we can recognize what legitimate points are, what legitimate ends are, while failing to play by the rules of the game. So after I lay out the argument for purpose and value, I'm going to conclude by emphasizing the importance of playing by the rules of the game. Now, I don't think the issue of purpose could be any more important to discuss than it is today. As much of the Western world shifts away from religion and towards atheism, and particularly materialism, the world is left with a gaping hole in their lives. Without moral commands or the divine direction that once guided individuals and nations, many irreligious are left searching for that which can infuse their lives with purpose. And most end up landing on some system of self-purpose because it's easy, it's convenient, it's unobtrusive. Now, this system of self-purposing generally means that each individual must figure out or fashion their own purpose in life. And once a purpose is identified, then life can meaningfully be lived out. While self-purposing sounds fantastic, I mean, who wouldn't want to just follow their own desires? There's at least one big problem for materialists. And that's because self-purposing is incoherent on their system. It can't be done. It's absolutely unintelligible. To discover why materialism can't provide purpose, and especially self-purpose, I want to explore deeper the concept of this purpose that we've been talking about. First, we need to understand that purpose is imported. So what is the purpose of an axe? I want you to think about that right now. Like, what's the purpose of an axe? It probably sounds like a really simple question, but just if you need to, pause for a minute and just think, what is the purpose of an axe? Now, I suppose that depends on who you ask. I mean, the maker of an axe might describe one purpose to you, and a lumberjack might agree with that purpose. Lizzie Borden, however, might take exception with the lumberjack. For Lizzie, the purpose of an axe was to take human life. Now, the first observation we can make about purpose is that purpose is something which is imported to an object. An axe is merely an axe and has no purpose of its own. It only obtains purpose when an outside object, its maker, a lumberjack, or Lizzie, when that individual imports purpose to it. However, that concept is probably hard to see because axes are kind of born with purposes because they're fashioned by makers. So let's talk about something that might be a little bit more fair, right? Something that potentially was created without a maker, if you assume naturalism, right? Let's talk about rocks. Now, I think most of us would agree that a rock we found in the middle of the desert is, for all intents and purposes, purposeless. It's just a hard object which formed over a long period of time and through natural and impersonal processes ended up residing in the desert. Rocks have no purpose in and of themselves. Now, the snake who lives under the rock might believe, if snakes can do such things, that the rock has great purpose. To the snake, this rock might serve the purpose of preserving its life. To a wayward or adventurous explorer, the rock may be purposed as a seat upon which she can rest. So while the rock, in and of itself, has no purpose, it can obtain purpose from the outside when others import purpose into it. Objects must be wielded. We could use the words used, implemented, right? They must be wielded to have purpose. The second concept here is that purpose then is going to require three entities or three parts. Let's think a little bit deeper about the rock in the desert and identify the components of purpose that are present in this situation. First, we have a rock sitting in the desert, and it's simply a neutral, unpurposed object. It just simply exists. However, when a traveler comes across the rock, she's able to import purpose into the rock. At the point the traveler imports purpose into the rock is no longer a mere or simple object, but it's actually an instrument. The traveler is able to transform the rock into an instrument because she is a purposer. And finally, we are going to have a goal, which in this case is going to be rest, right? The goal of the purposer is to rest. Notice that our goals are generally, and probably always, though I don't know, they're often or always intangible concepts. So while the traveler physically sits down on a rock, her goal is not to touch the rock with her posterior, but it's to achieve this concept of rest. One who uses the rock for a home may find physical shelter, but they do so for a more intangible concept of safety or comfort. Though goals may often be represented in objects which are physical, the ultimate goals are usually more intangible concepts which are physically embodied. Now, to make things a little bit simpler, here's a kind of a way that I would think about it, about the components required for purpose and the direction that purpose tends to flow. So there's a purposer, right? A subject here, a purposer, who does the action of infusing purpose into an object, and when that happens, this object becomes an instrument, and this action then produces a goal, right? It achieves a goal, an end. So you've got a purposer infusing purpose into an instrument for the action of their goal. Now notice how we have three separate components, essentially, right? Purposer, instrument, goal. And this is going to be really important to understand to make sense of our future discussion. So to expound on this concept just a little bit more, let's imagine that we had a rock with no other sentient creatures around. Nothing, right? Just this rock. Would it be possible for the rock to have purpose? I would say, of course it's not, right? The rock would just sit in the desert until it eroded away into absolutely nothing. Now, admittedly, that example seems really stupid, right? Because rocks can't think. So we're just talking about things outside of itself, which might not seem fair to a lot of naturalists who are like, yeah, but I can import purpose into myself if I was just sitting in the desert. So for the sake of argument then, let's extend the example by giving the rock a mind and volition. But before we do that, I do want to take one brief detour to lay a foundation for our understanding of materialism here. So materialism says that all that exists is physical. Right? There's no supernatural, and most materialists, right, would believe that there's nothing immaterial. There are people, some naturalists would believe in immaterial objects, which I guess they wouldn't be materialists, but they'd be naturalists. They believe in immaterial objects like mathematical numbers and stuff, like these abstract objects. But in general, right, naturalists and materialists, of course, are going to believe that there's no supernatural and no immaterial. So while certain aspects of that seem really apparent and inconsequential, the deeper implications of materialism are really significant as it pertains to purpose. Because if materialism is true, then not only are rocks, trees, and rivers material, but feelings and thoughts are material as well, manifesting as simply physical synapses firing in a physical brain. So love, the will, desire, everything, absolutely everything is simply material. Without a ghost in the machine, so to speak, a soul to act upon the material, then this is going to mean that every action, every thought, every feeling that we have is simply an inevitability which results from prior material conditions created by a cause and effect sequence initiated like dominoes all the way back at the Big Bang, up until the moment your synapses fired to produce action and caused you to inaccurately perceive that you actually intended to do something. So, without understanding materialism, we need to come to an understanding that purpose is going to require immaterialism. With this understanding of basic materialist implications, let's return to our rock in the desert and give it a mind and give it some will. Let's not give it legs. I think that's going to be going too far for our analogy. We're going to complicate things. So, no legs, can't go anywhere, can't do anything, but it's got a mind and it's got a will. On materialism, the thoughts that this rock has are really just physical processes occurring in cause and effect succession, right? The rock couldn't think other than what it does think. Now, please note that this is not very controversial for most intellectual materialists. This is a largely understood belief that they hold about cognition and self. And even if you want to throw quantum physics into this and you talk about indeterminacy and all that stuff, you're still okay. Then you just take like absolute determinism and you just make it random determination, right? It's still not you choosing something. It's just a flip of a coin that determines something for you. So it doesn't escape if you try to go the quantum route. So taking the mainstream materialist view on cognition, this rock scenario is going to provide us with two types of thoughts that nature could impart to the rock. Thoughts which correspond to reality, or thoughts which don't correspond to reality. And those are the only two options for this rock that's sitting there in the desert, with the thoughts and volition it has. Either the thoughts it has correspond to reality, or they don't. The first path for the rock would be for nature to impart true thoughts to the rock. Whether, there'd be no intent in nature, so it just so happened that the rock got true thoughts. Okay, the rock might think to itself, "Oh, I desire to sit here, a bastion in this barren landscape, to impart beauty and rest for any weary traveler who may pass by, before I weather and erode, becoming one with the earth again." And so, the rock does just that. It sits there in the desert, adding to the desert's landscape beauty that nobody else is going to see, and eventually it just dissolves back into the earth. The rock's desires corresponded with reality. The desires are aimed towards that which will likely happen given the nature of what a rock is. The rock desires only those things of which it is capable, and the rock desires things which nature will inevitably make happen. Now, perhaps nature rewarded the rock with good feelings for the correspondence of its beliefs with reality. Of course, nature can't do that. It doesn't intend anything, but maybe evolutionarily, right, this rock develops good feelings when there's a correspondence with reality. But in the end, the rock's true thoughts, they weren't prescriptive, right? Though the rock may have perceived them as such. As the rock neared its demise, it might have reflected back upon its life and thought about how accomplished it was for pursuing the purpose that it identified as worthy of pursuit. But ultimately, we observers who understand geology know that the rock simply underwent inevitable processes we could have explicitly described and predicted with our knowledge of how our mechanistic world works. The rock's perception that it was purposing or prescribing for itself then was really simply descriptions of what actually occurred and what couldn't have been otherwise. Nature was just kind enough to let the rock in on its ultimate fate ahead of time. Nature gave the rock desires which corresponded with the reality to which nature would eventually and inevitably lead the rock. Now, the second mental path for the rock on materialism is to have thoughts and volitions which don't correspond with future reality. Maybe the rock believes that one day he's going to be a star. He's going to travel the rugged terrain, cross vast distances, and join some band of like-minded rocks. With this rock band, this rock star would change the world. While this immovable rock may have had lofty aspirations, those aspirations never had the possibility of being achieved. But nature has no concern for truth. And so this rock could have spent a lifetime pursuing the impossible, while achieving only the inevitable. To our rock, he may look back on his life and identify his failed purpose as misfortune or missed opportunities, or he may thank the rock gods for unanswered prayers because he loved his life and realized his dreams would have really made his life a nightmare. But all of that is really irrelevant, right? Nature did what it did, and it couldn't have been any other way. The feelings and beliefs of the rock are irrelevant. Regardless of the rock's thoughts and their correspondence to reality, notice that in both examples, the rock accomplished nothing. In a materialistic universe, both the rock's ultimate fate and the rock's course of action, including mental actions like the rock's own thoughts, they were determined. No matter what the rock thought, or rather, whatever thoughts nature dictated to the rock, its destiny was to sit in the desert and be eroded into dust. The laws of physics couldn't have had it any other way. Now, while such a thing is easy to understand with an immovable rock, you could just extrapolate that out further because the same is true of we humans on materialism. Though we are more complex than rocks, we are mere matter in motion, set on an unavoidable course, a determined course, which includes even our thoughts. Now, this is exactly where materialists start to go very wrong in their assumption that we can purpose ourselves. As I explained above, purpose requires three things: a purposer, an instrument, and a goal or an end. To get those three components, materialists unwittingly smuggle immaterialist notions in their assumption that we can purpose ourselves. Materialists import an immaterial self, or a soul, into their equation. Materialists act as though I, a purposer, purpose my physical body, an instrument, to accomplish some goal. Now, there's a huge problem with that. There is no distinct I on materialism. They're borrowing a concept that only dualism can give them, something only possible if humanity is composed of a body and a soul, some immaterial third party distinct from the body. But on materialism, there is no self separate from the body and physical processes. We might perceive that we are distinct entities from our corporeal bodies, or that we have a self, but this concept is really just a chemical fiction told in our brains. Like our rock star friend, our failure of our beliefs to comport with reality has no bearing on our ultimate end. It only serves to placate and delude us into a life which tends towards survival until we, like the rock, return to dust. But if that's the case, what happens when we remove a third entity from this equation? When we remove the purposer from our equation? Remember, purposer infuses purpose into an instrument, or object becomes an instrument, which then, through action, accomplishes a goal, right? But let's take out our purposer, right? Because there is no distinct self on materialism. Without prescription, without intentionality, without this third party, we're left with a much different equation, right? Rather than purposer, instrument, goal, we end up with just cause and effect, or action, reaction, right? We just have not an instrument, we just have an object and an action. One is dominoes. One object has an action that was started way back at the beginning of time, and that domino hits the next one, which hits the next one, just object hitting object hitting object. There's nothing to infuse purpose here because there is no self. It's all just action, reaction. Now, causes are impersonal, and so are effects. A cause only becomes an instrument when it is purposed. An axe is an object, and an axe was the cause of Lizzie's parents' death. But the axe, purposed as a weapon in the hands of a third-party purposer, became more than a mere cause. It actually transformed into an instrument in the hands of Lizzie. The same could not be true without a purposer, right? An axe could not have transformed into an instrument in the hands of something impersonal, like the wind. The wind has no intentionality, and were it to blow an axe onto the heads of Lizzie's parents, only an unblamable natural disaster would have occurred, not a murder. Likewise, Lizzie's parents dropping dead from something impersonal, like cancer, would simply be an effect. But when they dropped dead at their daughter's hands, their deaths were more than mere effects of some impersonal process. Their deaths were a realized goal, from Lizzie's perspective. On materialism, the deaths of Lizzie's parents aren't really a tragedy, but rather were an unavoidable outcome of materialistic cause and effect processes. A coherent world of materialism removes the possibility of purposers. Without purposers, despite what your mechanistic brain might tell you, you are purposeless. And without a distinct I, or self, there's nothing you can do to add purpose to your own life. You're just a part of the universe. There is no you. You are simply an object formed by causes, and you are just an object heading towards unavoidable effects. While you might hope the effects of your life are not similar to those of Lizzie's parents, only time will tell, and there's nothing you can do about it. And even if there were, you wouldn't do it unless the universe just mechanistically caused you to do that thing. So at this juncture, some materialists might argue that while we may not purpose ourselves without an immaterial soul, we could certainly be purposed by another being, right? A third party. Just as the axe was infused with purpose by Lizzie, something outside of itself, so perhaps I could be infused with purpose by another, maybe a lover or a friend, somebody else. But there are two big problems with this. The first problem is that on materialism, there are no third parties. We're in a closed system. All that exists is matter and the laws of the universe or multiverse. While we humans may create words and terms to differentiate unique formations of matter throughout the universe, there's nothing in the universe which demands that these things be distinguished. Let me provide an example here that might help. There's a popular kids song on the internet back when my kids were little called Finger Family. Right? In the song, all 5 digits of the hand are named. Right? Mother finger, daddy finger, etc. Now, I can go around and name all of the parts of my body, big and small, from every quirk in my body to every large structure. However, we all understand that it would be ludicrous of me to believe that when you're talking to me, my finger, head, or any other part of me is distinct from me. Myself is composed of all of me, and you don't have to address every part of me. You simply address me. Everything that you are composed of is a part of you. And while we can distinguish different formations and different compositions at different parts in your body, and while we can assign different vocabulary for different features, all parts of your body are still you. Now, I fail to see how a materialistic universe would really be any different. Sure, there might be a lump of flesh over there, which I identify as Tom, and one over there I identify as Sally, but each human, like me, is just going through the mechanistic cause and effect processes that I'm going through. We're all part of this one universe. We compose the universe's body with no distinguishing otherness that demands that I identify one person or object as one thing and another as a separate entity. We're all just the universe. Distinguishing different parts of the universe might be a useful speech fabrication. It is not an observation of genuine otherness. While we can acknowledge distinct features, features are very different than distinct identities, distinct volitions, etc. If the universe dictates everything, and we are all part of this one universe, then we have no reason to think there is any legitimate party, any party beyond this one universe, or any party beyond this one universe which is an intentional being. While this first response undermines the logical coherence of believing a third party can purpose us in a materialistic universe, since there are no clearly distinct third parties in a materialistic world, the second problem lies with the intuitively moral incoherence of such a system. If a materialist wants to argue that the only way they can maintain purpose is by saying that we receive our purpose from others, then we have some major disconnects here. What could the materialist say about the rights of African enslaved in the Americas? even if the materialist pretends such things weren't inevitabilities in a mechanistic world, and even if they pretended like there are legitimate identity differences which could allow distinct human beings to purpose others, they would still have no grounds to say that such a travesty as slavery was wrong. If we receive our purpose from others, then surely others can ascribe whatever purpose they desire to us. So long as one group is stronger and more domineering than another, they can purpose whatever purposes they desire to win. Now, try telling that to the sex-trafficked girls or the victims of barbaric despots. For as angry as Dawkins and Hitchens get at a God who dictates our purpose and value, how could they not be more off-put by other ignorant mortals being the determiners of their value? Certainly we may be living in such a hopeless world where the powerful can purpose as they wish without transgressing any objective morality. But if we do live in such a world, our speech about human rights needs to shift from one which implements absolute truth language to one which uses preferential language. I don't like slavery, but if someone wants to do it and can, that's their prerogative. If you don't like that option, the alternative is to just keep living inconsistently in self-delusion about the incoherence of such a system and the non-existence of objective morality and purpose. The only possibility for materialists to escape their purposelessness is to fabricate some unexplainable self. Assuming this unfounded and non-explanatory explanation, surely if I purpose myself and you purpose yourself, then it would be wrong of you to use your will to encroach on my goals. While this view would carry a number of huge issues like moral intuition and oughtness or obligation, our inconsistency in stopping suicidal people, perhaps the worst part of this is going to be that the materialists invoke a gaps argument. We don't know, it just isn't the type of explanation seemingly scientific materialists like to invoke, and one that they often critique. Yet it's all I can see that they're left with when discussing purpose formation in a materialistic universe, other than simply admitting that life is meaningless and there is no such thing as purpose. The big question for me then is, does Christian immaterialism get us something better? And I think it most certainly does. On Christianity, God, an immaterial being, creates ensouled humanity. Humanity has one choice before God, before them, the choice to submit to the purpose of their purposer, God, or the choice to attempt to create their own purpose. Now notice how Adam and Eve have a soul, and in theory can purpose themselves because they are dualistic creatures. Their souls, their selves, are able to use their bodies as instruments for the purposes they fashion unto certain ends. Unfortunately, Adam and Eve attempted to create their own purpose, rather than submit to being instruments of their Creator God. While it was possible for them to form their own desired purpose, God's warning that such an action would be devastating came true. You can use a hammer to hit nails, as the maker intended, but you can also use it to smash tight lids off of glass jars. But hammers were made for one thing by their makers, and to use them otherwise will often lead to damage and ineffectiveness. Adam and Eve, in pursuit of their own fashioned purposes, threw off their maker's design and purpose, and as Lizzie's in her misuse of the axe, they have wreaked havoc on the human family. My big question, however, is whether ensouled creatures are truly able to create their own purpose. Now, when Adam and Eve rebelled, did they at least lead a successful rebellion? Did they at least create some momentary pleasure and self-purposing as they raised their fists to God? In the end, it seems to me that they failed. Their self-purposing failed not only because it threw off their maker's intent, but also because it ended up reorganizing our equation. Just think about God's equation versus Adam and Eve's self-purposing equation. Right? God's equation, as we discussed, is you have a purposer, who would be God. You have instruments, so creation or humanity. And then you have the goal, right? Glorifying God in loving community. So love God, love others, right? Together. Now, if you take a look at Adam and Eve's self-purposing equation, you have the purposer, which is humanity. You have the instrument, which is whatever it is we choose. And then you have the goal, which is self-fulfillment and pleasure, right? Accomplishing one's own purposes. Now, here's what's intriguing about our fallenness and our self-purposing. Only instruments have purpose. As humble instruments in the hands of God, we could recognize our purpose. We could submit and end up living in love, fellowship, peace, and fulfillment. But when we self-purpose, we deceive ourselves into thinking that we are infusing purpose into ourselves when we're really infusing purpose into objects. We call that idolatry. Now take, for example, farming. If I toss God to the side and say, you know what, I feel called to be a farmer. I will be fulfilled by living off the land and producing crops to provide for my loved ones and community. Notice that I'm actually infusing purpose into farming rather than into myself. Me, right, infusing purpose into farming, and farming produces the action of fulfillment. When we attempt to create purpose rather than recognize our purpose, we end up infusing purpose into objects that we end up using for ourselves. Now, in such a system where we attempt to create our own purpose, we still end up being purposeless ourselves, not because we don't have purpose, but because we fail to recognize our purpose as instrumented by God. So we're giving all this purpose to other things, yet still not receiving purpose ourselves. Self-purposing not only fails on materialism, but it also falls short on immaterialism as well. God has created a beautiful world. In this world, fulfillment comes through our submission to God's design, being instruments for service and love. He has purposed us to do that. Now, how ironic is it that true fulfillment calls us to be willing instruments who serve others? When you think about that, how awesome would a world be where we never had to really question someone else's motives? What would it be like to live in a world where you never had to question whether every other human being had your best interest in mind? They were living out their purpose to serve God in loving community, and they loved you, and that fulfilled them. That was their purpose in helping and loving you too. Everyone would be at your service, and you would be looking out for your best interest, knowing that you're likewise not seeking to manipulate or objectify them. You're not seeking to infuse your own purposes into them, right? But you are submitting to your purpose of being a lover of others. But man, we worship individualism, and we think that being an instrument sounds terrible and condescending. But that's not really the case when your maker is love, right? By foregoing this intended submission to God and neighbor and world, we not only sin by creating idols and worshiping self, but we lose any chance of having true and lasting purpose. And I think that's ultimately the crux of why I wanted to have this episode where it is here at the end of our season on simplicity. Because there's a lot about purposing that seems kind of counterintuitive. Everybody thinks that the best way to go about things is following your desires, choosing what it is that you want to value, giving into the things that provide you the most pleasure, forming your own purpose, right? And what you find out is that when you infuse purpose into everything else, that's still not finding purpose for yourself. To have purpose, what you need to do is to submit to yourself as an instrument. And that sounds like you're being objectified. But when you understand that, God is love, and he shows us what love is through Jesus, and you submit to yourself as being an instrument, only then can you find your purpose. Going back to our sports analogy from the other episode, right? Like if you think about being whatever it is, if we go to soccer again, being a forward, right? Your purpose is essentially to score goals. You're not going to be coming back too much and playing deep defense on your own side, right? Your purpose is to score goals. If you're out of position, if you are not being used as an instrument, then you're not serving your purpose. Right? Linemen don't try to be wide receivers. Now, sometimes they might catch a ball, like tipped ball or something, but like they're not wide receivers, and they shouldn't try to be, because if they try to be, it's going to ruin everything. They have to submit to what it is their purpose is. And so, as we've gone through this season on simplicity, and we think if God created us to be lovers of Him and lovers of other people, what is it that is going to fulfill us? It's not hoarding things. It's not accumulating things. That's actually going to mar our souls. It might provide us kind of pleasure, and maybe we will identify the purpose of life as to have the most pleasure, to accumulate the most things. But because that's not what we were created to be, it's really not going to fulfill us. So it's going to fail at fulfillment, and it's also going to mar us. And so understanding the way that God created the world, and understanding that we are instruments, and that we find our purpose in our submission to our instrumentality, and that because our God is love, this submission to instrumentality, our use as instruments, is not being an objectified, wielding in an objectified fashion by God, but His purpose and His example is love. And it's that outward looking to other people. In Eden, right? They didn't realize they're naked because Adam was looking out for Eve and nature and God, and Eve was looking out for Adam and nature and God. And they didn't notice their own nakedness. So, living a simple life is still extremely challenging. To give up our resources, to not pursue every pleasure, to not be in a hurry, to not be consequentialist, to not embrace technique and efficiency in everything. And that's really challenging in our culture, of course, especially, but just as human beings in general, who are often living in rebellion, thinking that autonomy and self-sufficiency are really the ways that we create our purpose and live the most meaningful life. But if you recognize where purpose comes from, then it should cause you to think, okay, so I can't make my own purpose. I need to find it. What is the fabric of the universe made of? Where am I going to find my purpose? In a materialistic world, which we addressed, you're not going to find any, right? And you can't create any. So that's hopeless. In a theistic universe, we have to identify what are the ends of God as well as what are the means of God. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in our next episode. So hopefully this gives you some encouragement to throw off the lies of self-purposing that you might feel within yourself, as well as to find out what purpose is. And if God's purpose for us involves, like if His means involve a simple life, then hopefully this gives you the courage and the strength to start living more simply.
That's all for now. So peace, and because I'm a pacifist, when I say it, I mean it. This podcast is a part of the Kingdom Outpost Network. Please check out the links below to find other great podcasts and content related to nonviolence and kingdom living.